So thanks for everyone to coming to the NE Bytes for February 2023. Quick couple of announcements, really. We've got a new website, finally. NEBytes.net has been fallow for a long while we were locked out of our Office 365 account, and it got cancelled and removed and everything else. I've moved that across to GitHub now, so we've got a new home with next events and all kinds of bits and pieces in there. So that's something to look at going forward. We've still got the Pragmatic bookshelf with the special code. Pragmatic programmers are giving us 30% off until the middle of March. So still take advantage of that if you haven't done so already. If you feel like getting a technical book of some sort. And with all that out of the way, Mike's been very kind enough to offer to come along to this evening and talk about application insights, what it can do for you in Azure. And so I will stop sharing my screen and turn everything over to Mike.
Awesome. So I can get this screen share going. Do you want me to turn the camera on as well, guys?
If you like.
Yeah, I'm not sure how.
Yep, see you there.
Camera,
That's cool.
so I don't know if it. Yeah, so welcome to my little office bottom of the garden log cabin. So I do work from home a lot. I work for a lot of overseas companies, so I during lockdown I decided to get myself a little shed at the bottom of the garden, but it's about 20 foot by 10 foot, so it's a nice, decent size one, and it's quite nicely kitted out with gear as well, so it's good for working. So thanks for coming along, everybody who's wanting to learn about application insights. I think we've got a nice small group, so I think we can be a bit more cozy, and I think if anybody has questions as we go, we can maybe like deep dive into a few of the topics, and I can maybe show you a bit more of the things that you guys might want to ask about. Whereas a bigger group, you tend to have to be a bit more general. So hopefully it can make a better session. I think sometimes the smaller group, but what we're going to talk about today is app insights and log analytics, the relationship between the two, and we'll just explore some scenarios. And I'm going to kind of tell you guys a little bit of a story to go with it, because I think sometimes jumping into the tech too quickly without understanding the context of what you're looking at, I think makes it difficult. I guess just to sort of set levels, is anybody on the call fairly comfortable with app insights and log analytics already, or is it something that you are just looking to learn a bit more about, but it's not something you've necessarily used before? If you can pop a note in the chat as well. If he's
Richard Peck, I've not used it in anger, but Work's got us looking at it as a way to do some performance analysis on the applications that they're building, and it's kind of treading new territory for us. So I've done a lot of reading over the last fortnight, and this is very, very coincidentally handy.
Oh, perfect. I think we've just got somebody else joined there as well. Okay, so a little bit about me. So I've probably met you guys before at NE Bytes in the past, but anyone who hasn't met me, so based in Newcastle, I've been a Microsoft MVP for 14 years. So I came originally from a BizTalk integration background. I'm a freelance cloud architect. I'm very lucky, actually. I got the opportunity to work with Azure when it was first in preview, and I've kind of worked with it pretty much ever since. And I used to kind of tech lead at Bupa. It's Bupa Healthcare, one of the early big customers on Azure. So we got to do some really cool stuff back then, which kind of really accelerated my experience with Azure. And then nowadays, I sort of split my time working with a bunch of different companies who are doing various flavors of Azure. Do quite a bit of work with some companies in the US and Canada as well, so it's quite cool. I blog quite a lot. I tend to blog more about things like APIs and integration type scenarios. I do quite a lot with Terraform as well, so if ever anybody wants to sort of chat and learn a bit about Terraform, feel free to give me a shout on that. Do a bit of Twitter and LinkedIn and that kind of thing. So if you haven't connected with me before, feel free to. The question for today's sessions: how can we use log analytics and app insights to help build a better supportable solution? So we're going to go through a few different kind of challenges that you might have where app insights can help you. The background of the project, so as I said, I want to relate it back to real world use cases, which I think will help kind of describe the technology a bit. So one of the customers I've worked with, big sort of oil company over in Canada, they've done a multi-year investment in Microsoft iPaaS. So they've got lots of logic app stuff, lots of API service bus and integration into things like SAP, SuccessFactors, Workday. They do a lot with Power Platform as well, and they've also got a big Synapse investment, which we've done quite a bit with. So it's maybe if ever you want to do a talk about Synapse, I've got some quite interesting stuff on that area as well. But just to give you the idea that it's one of these typical sort of big enterprise customers. And for us, when you start thinking about the size of logic apps we've got, so we've got 1895, I think, when I put this slide together. It's probably quite a few more than that now, but that's across all environments. So we've probably got in the region of 500 in production. So one of the things I find is a lot of the times with talks, you're talking about like a single scenario, and what works for one integration or one application use case, when you scale it up to lots of them, it's a kind of a different sort of perspective on the problem. And I'm hoping that coming away from today, you'll have some ideas that'll help with that. So at this company, we've got this enterprise integration platform. They're predominantly based around Microsoft Platform as a Service. So as I say, we use lots of things like functions, API management, logic apps, Synapse, et cetera, we try to position this as our capability diagram of what technology piece goes to what capability, and management and monitoring on the left there is really where application insights and log analytics fit. So they're the bits we're going to look at. Now, to understand the business problems, so as a company, as I say, they're in the energy oil kind of sector, and one of the things they do is they have a plant that builds polypropylene pellets. So the scenario here is we've got the plant on the left. They're going to create pellets. So if you imagine, the easiest way to always think about it is, I don't really do a lot inside the plant, but I always think about this idea of a big cauldron that we put lots of ingredients in. Out of it comes these polypropylene pellets that get loaded into rail cars, and then we ship those rail cars to customers who've bought the rail car. Then they make all sorts of plastics and that kind of thing with those pellets. So if you imagine, we have a few use cases we'll talk about today. So the first one's plant production. So when the plant creates stuff, you get all these operational technology sensors that detect certain measurements and things like that. And they send them from the plant to head office to say, this is what's going on in this part of the plant. And we can do things from inventory management to health and safety stuff and all sorts of stuff. And the idea is that those messages going across there would be coming from systems in the plant up into head office. We then have the idea of a rail car being loaded. So if you imagine we've got pellets to load, the rail car goes into the plant, goes into a loading dock, gets loaded, it then goes out to the storage yard, and we'll send a notification to say we've got a rail car that's loaded and ready to sell. We then have customer who'll come along and ask for I'll place an order, can I have one car? So we allocate the car to the order and then ship it. So when that happens, events go back to head office to say, right, there's a car en route to a customer. And then as the car travels, so if you imagine over in the North America, these cars can go to Canada, America, Mexico. Some of them get loaded onto ships and shipped overseas. But in general, as the cars are traveling around, we get GPS events from them. So every time they stop and start and hit certain locations, they'll tell us where they are. And then we get these sort of updates and then delivery notifications, so we always know where the rail cars are and stuff. Now, from an integration perspective, if you think we've really got about 5 use cases there. So from the plant, we had these measurement data use cases. We had the rail car being loaded, and you can see how different interfaces would go to different systems from a logical perspective. And then we've got 3 events around the rail car, again, which integrate into different systems. So we've got things like Dataverse and SAP and stuff like that. And this is where really the first challenge that App Insights helps you with is this understanding the kind of the layout. So if you imagine from a logic app perspective, we said there's about 500 logic apps. You're probably talking in the region of about 10 or 12 of them deal with these use cases here. So scale that up across all of the integrations of the entire company, and you've got quite a big sort of environment there to kind of manage, monitor, operate. Now, if we think about these use cases, how they're implemented is I've got the rail cars and the plants, they send messages to our API management solution. The API management just back ends onto some functions where there's a little bit of logic in the functions just to do some validation and kind of set some stuff up, and then we drop them on the service bus. And then we've got 2 routes from there. So if it's a message we're going to integrate into various systems, we've got a number of logic apps that drive from service bus and integrate into different systems in the back end. And then likewise, we've got this function app up here, which really is a bit like a shovel concept, where it's just getting messages routed to it from service bus, shoving them into the Synapse ecosystem. So what we actually do there is we go in via an event hub, and you can use the capture feature of event hubs that writes it into the data lake, and then you can start querying them off from Synapse. So in the first thing we're going to look at is about like live metrics and performance monitoring. So we're going to look at this use case here where we've got this plant measurement data coming in, routing through functions into Synapse. But before we jump into that, one of the things I want to talk about is the relationship between Log Analytics and App Insights. So here's my Log Analytics workspace at the bottom. That's the name of it, just so if you spot it in some of the Azure demos, you'll be familiar with that. And what we do is, and there's a couple of different ways people might set this up, but the way I quite like to do it is, if you think of Application Insights as being a bit like a view on top of Log Analytics. So a few years ago, there were 2 completely separate products. Then they brought this kind of change out where they kind of made App Insights point to a Log Analytics workspace. And for a while, they called it something like workspace-based App Insights or something like that. But now they're kind of deprecating that. So all moving forward, all App Insights will point to Log Analytics under the hood. And I think the easiest way to describe it is if you think of a database concept, so Log Analytics is really like the tables and where the data is stored. And App Insights kind of gives you views on top of that make it easy for a given context. So what I did is we have an App Insights for our API management. Logic app consumption we're going to look at. Now that doesn't really support App Insights, but that'll directly send to Log Analytics. Logic app standards. So, maybe people aren't as familiar with logic apps, but there's 2 different flavors that support 2 different kind of workloads. Logic app standards newer, based on an app service and function app concept. It supports App Insights. So I've got one for my logic app standard. And then I've got 2 flavors of function apps, again, which both have their own App Insights. But what I've done is all these App Insights all point to the same Log Analytics under the hood, and I'm just treating them a bit like a view. Now, what you do have is some companies, they'll set up one App Insights, one Log Analytics, and point everything to it, which works, works perfectly fine. I just find for me, the data's a little bit harder to mine if you've got them all in one place, because you get things like the performance metrics will go to App Insights, and you'll be able to, it'll be a bit awkward to work out which performance metrics work for which plan, and that's, I think, doing it this way for me, I've just found it's a bit easier. There's not really any difference, particularly cost-wise, in it. So just caveat that that there is costs for App Insights and Log Analytics, but I think doing it this way versus one App Insights and one Log Analytics wouldn't be any different cost-wise. Okay, so first off, we're going to look at performance and load monitoring. So my question is, how can we view the performance and load of my solution in near real time? We're going to look at this use case of the plant sending data. It's going to end up in Synapse, but we're really looking at this green box here. And we're going to look at particularly the function apps and the API M. So I'm going to just leave that there for a second. So the first question you probably have is, right, what does an App Insights instance look like? So here we've got one. This is the API management one. So you'll notice from the name at the top here, typical Azure setup, you've got all these different features down the side. Now, how you would configure your App Insights for the different use cases is slightly different depending on what you're doing. So in a function app, so if we go over here, you basically just need to put an app setting in the function app. So you'll see, give it a second. So you've got a couple of app settings here. So depending on what frameworks they're using and stuff, sometimes it's instrumentation key, sometimes it's connection string. It's moving towards connection string with all the newer stuff. But sometimes you'll find these get added out the box by the Azure portal when you set stuff up. But basically, for things like a function app, if you just add that key, it'll automatically start collecting some telemetry about your how your app's performing if it's running on an app service or something like that. So that's really easy to set up. You can do it with zero code changes as well. You can, I'll show you in a second, you can add some stuff to your code to enrich the data that you would see. Now, with an API management, so this is my API management instance here. And in the middle, I've got a whole bunch of different APIs that I've built. And this inbound plant data one is the one we're going to look at today. And in the settings bit, all I need to do is down here. So I guess one bit I've missed on here, you would link one or more application insights instances to this API M. And then in the API itself, you would just turn on App Insights and pick which App Insights instance you want the data to go through. And then you've got, you can configure sampling and headers and message bodies that you want to capture and stuff like that. So it's quite easy to set it up. Now, one concept in App Insights we'll talk about a bit more later, but if anyone has questions later, bring me back to sampling, because that's quite a key concept in App Insights. But I'll just mention that it's there for now, and we'll talk about it later on. In my function apps, I'm just going to bring some code over here. There's a really simple function that receives these plant tags, and you can see I kind of pass the message, validate it, transform it. But what I'm doing here is I'm going to add some stuff to my telemetry. So in a function, you typically would get this iLogger parameter passed into your function. So anything, if you've got App Insights configured, anything you use that iLogger, for example, down here, this log information, that would end up as a trace message in App Insights. So it's really easy. Just log info, it'll appear as a message in App Insights. But what you can also do is you can use these activities here, and you can add properties to it. So I'm adding things like my message type, and I'm adding some custom properties from my request, and they'll become searchable and appear as properties on your App Insights telemetry messages, which we'll look at later as well. So it's quite cool that. And again, quite easy to set it up, which is the key thing. And what will happen is when my function gets called, there'll automatically be a request will appear in App Insights. It'll have some of this data on, and then these will appear as trace messages. Now, what we're going to look at to start with, I'm just going to shut that down, to start with for the performance monitoring is we're going to look at this feature called Live Metrics, which I think is quite a common one if you have, if you've got a website running with App Insights going, or you've got an API or something like that, you commonly just want to know how's it working, what's it running like. So I'm going to, I'll just drag a couple of tabs in here, so we'll put that one open. In fact, actually, we don't need that one. Just going to shrink these down a bit. give you a bit of a flavour that there's some traffic going on here. So kind of see a bit of stuff in the background of these dashboards. So I do have in my demos, by the way, that I will have a bit of traffic happening in the background. So you'll see this little dot here was a request to my API from something. Now, what I'm going to do just to drive a bit of load through this system is I've got a little demo console app, and I've just got it on another screen here, and it's going to simulate pinging a whole bunch of messages to that API. So I'm just going to kick that off and run it. I'll just drag it in once the console app starts up. Right, so you can see it's just starting to kick off there, and it'll just start hammering a bunch of load at that API in a second. So we should start seeing requests appear more actively in here. You can see there's some incoming requests on this. So this one here is the background function that pushes it into Synapse. This one here is the functions that sit behind the API, and this is the API itself. Now, the live metrics should be, like, give or take a second or two behind the actual activity, just because you've got the time it takes behind the scenes for App Insights to get the telemetry data. But that's the first thing you'll start getting a flavor of how these different components are running. Now I'm just going to free a bit of screen space up here. And we can see on the dashboard, we've got things like requests. We've got the rate of requests. This is the duration here, so they're pretty quick. You've got this thing called dependencies. So one of the really cool features in App Insights is it can automatically detect if your code makes an external call to something like a SQL database or an HTTP endpoint and a few other things, and it'll basically track how long those dependencies take and if they're getting errors and stuff like that, so you can query out some of that data later. And you can see we're currently running about 30 requests a second, so it's nicely chugging away there. And that's really the live metrics overview. This is like, how am I doing kind of at the minute. Now, what you can do after that, so say we have a performance issue or we want to just see what the performance is like, you can go into this performance tab and you'll get a list of your operations here. So you can see I've had a few railcar messages today. I'll see if I can sort them by. There you go. So that'll be the plant data. So I've had a bunch of messages kind of come through for the plant data here. And you can see this bit here particularly is the API management response time. So the API management response time is going to be from my console app sends to the API, that starts the counter, goes through the function onto service bus, back through function again as the response through APIM, and as it leaves APIM, that's when that duration stops. You can see that one's working quite quickly, but this one here might be a bit slower. So you can see here, for example, you get your percentiles of the calls. So you can see I've not got that many calls here, but you get an idea from this graph about how many calls are like what percentage of your calls are falling into what performance bracket area. I'll just see if there's one that has a bit more of a spread out graph. Yeah, so you see here, from a performance perspective, I've got 95% of my calls are 130 milliseconds or less, but actually most of them are like sort of 50 odd milliseconds there, but you're occasionally getting a longer one, so you're getting that flavor of what the performance is like. And you can see things like your dependencies here. So the back end, I can see all of my calls have really got this back end, and I'm sure you can usually click on these. Maybe I'm wrong. So that was the button I was looking for. So you can click on it and you can go and have a look at a few examples here. And you can see I click on this one. Now, in the next section, I'm going to show a bit of a distributed tracing scenario, but I could click on this and open it out and kind of have a look at what's going on. The next feature is this failures bit. So here, if I click on failures, don't think I've got any, have we? Or have we? Does this maybe need a refresh? It's an Azure portal thing. Well, that says there's 5,000 failures there. Well, oh no, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. There's 0 failures. So if you had any failures, you would see the operations here and how many failures you've had, and you'd be to click on them and start like drilling into some of the reasons why they'd failed and stuff. So that's a really good way I find spotting, like to me, one of the things that's really common in these kind of architectures is you might have an operation that's getting errors you don't really realize is happening. So you can start looking for API operations that might be problematic that you haven't realized here, which is quite good. Okay, so quick recap on this section. And so App Insight's really easy to configure. You just create the resource, you add it to APIM, or you add a config parameter to an app service. You can actually use App Insights from other things. So you can install an agent on a VM. You can use it in your own custom code if you've got like a console app by adding an SDK. There's lots of ways you can start using it. In the functions, you can use this iLogger, and you can just send additional customization of that log data. Sorry, I've got that on the wrong screen there. Real bad habit of doing that. So next up, we're going to think about end-to-end tracing. So I think this is the bit where people will start seeing deep dive value on some of these trace messages that we're going to get. So if we have lots of components, how can we trace activity across components? So if you think about the architectures we build today, they tend to be less like those monolithic architectures and more a number of components maybe running on different servers that work together to solve a problem. So that makes, there's flexibility benefits and stuff like that that come with smaller components, but it creates a different problem, which is this distributed troubleshooting. So if we think about the couple of scenarios we've got here about loaded rail car shipping status and delivery, we can see there's lots of different stuff going to different systems, and you've got problems here. Like, let's say we lose a rail car, we might want to say what interfaces have we done for this given rail car ID or something like that, or did Cosmos got its update but Dataverse didn't. Those are the kind of troubleshooting problems you might get where you need distributed tracing. And here, so the scenario on this one is a little bit bigger than the previous one. So we've got the plant for the loaded rail car sends that message to APIM. It goes through the functions, it goes through service bus. To fill this demo out a bit further, what I've done is I've got a consumption logic app that receives the message about a loaded rail car. It does a bunch of enrichment, so we'll have a little bit of a look at that logic app because we'll look at it more later on. It creates a canonical message for that rail car and then republishes it back to service bus, where a number of other logic apps will kick off. So here, one logic app will kick off, but over here, 5 or 6 might, about one for each system in this pub sub scenario. So I'll just close a couple of things here. So if you imagine I've got load for this demo running all the time, where I've got a little helper logic app that goes and every day it creates a new rail car and then it delays and every few hours it sends updates for it. So we'll see here that we'll receive, so we'll see this coming in. So here's my message received from service bus, and I'll get a message that looks a bit like this one here. So I'm going to grab this load slip ID, and then you can see as we go down, got a number of shapes in this logic app. All these HTTP calls are me calling API management to do some conversions and stuff like that. Then we republish back to service bus down here, and then that's going to kick off my other logic apps via service bus. And you can see there's a whole bunch of workflows. This is the logic app standard, whereas this one's the consumption one. You can see the loaded rail car. We've got rail car loaded to CRM, to SAP, to the transport system. And we'll see here, let's load up. You'll see you'll get the run history again here. So one of the great things about logic apps is you get this thing called run history, where I can go and have a look. Here's the message we received off service bus. So that's what that message looked like. I can see that I would have called SAP down here, and I got a 200 response that everything was good. And maybe it gets more complicated, but logic apps is really good for troubleshooting and orchestration type workflow. But the problem is because I've got, back here, I've got these 3 different logic apps. It's not always as easy to work out which one got what message and who had a problem processing and stuff. So One of the things, just before I show the next bit, I just want to show in here, one of the caveats with App Insights, if you remember at the start, I said Logic App consumption doesn't support App Insights. So if I want to see data from this bit, I'd have to go to the log analytics and do some custom queries, but these bits here, you'll be able to see what we're going to show with distributed tracing is it'll like wind through, show data from here, which is really what the distributed tracing is about. So if I start, where's the API management one? Actually, I'm not sure if we've got a chat message there. All right, cool, it's just a message from earlier. So we're looking at this feature now called transaction search. So what I can do here is I can go and say, right, show me the data for the last 24 hours, and I'll get a load of things coming up, and you'll see I've got you know, things like dependency calls, requests, availability, and you know, you're going to get an absolute mountain of data in here. But to make life a bit easier, I'm going to just search for requests. So here you'll see I've got the, you know, there's a lot of, I've got these health checks we'll talk about later on, but you'll see they're the most frequent traffic. But you'll see I've got like these plant messages we had earlier, so I can click on one, I can open it up, I can see that it called my back end function and stuff like that. And what I'm going to do is I grabbed, back when we were in this Logic app, I grabbed the load slip IDs. There's two really important values in this message. One of them is the rail car ID, which is here. So if you imagine a rail car goes into the plant, gets filled, goes to a customer, gets emptied, goes back to the plant and gets refilled again. So the rail car ID identifies the car itself. The load slip ID is unique for each time the car gets loaded. So what I can do in here is I can go and do a search for that rail car. Search here. So you'll see there's a bunch of requests that have came up here. So now I can tell this one here is for the rail car getting loaded. This one's for its shipping. That's a shipping status update. That's a delivery. And there's some help requests where some of the Logic apps call an API to do some pieces, and you can see it's picked up that the IDs in there as well. So I'm starting to see across my component different places that load slip ID is being used. Now, one of the things you'll notice here that there's two differences between these two requests here. Firstly, if I open this one up, what will happen is if you notice at start up here, you'll see little messages where it's trying to unwind the Logic app, the data across the components. But because we've got that consumption Logic app, it's kind of passing data to the API. It's going to this one here is the back end function behind that API management. So if you notice the name here is Bootcamp Function API rather than Bootcamp API-M, but it stops at that point, which is a bit of a shame because where the consumption app is, the consumption Logic app, it doesn't flow that tracing through there, if you remember back on the diagram. But what you can do, if we take the shipping status one, you'll see this should wind through most. It's retrieving items. Okay, now, so what happened here, it's the same thing. We've got the API-M received the request, forwarded it to the function app, but now we can see we've got some Logic apps showing up here, and I can go, right, do I want the Cosmos or the CRM? Let's have a look at the CRM. So it'll start opening that out, and this is now starting to pull in all of the telemetry from that Logic app. So here, what you kind of see here is that if you see this little icon here, this represents one of the shapes in the Logic app. So that'll be the activation shape. So let me see what that one was called when a message is received. So that'll match to this bit here, that shape there. And then this one here will match the invocation of that. And then you've got this one here, if you notice it says initialize variable. So that's going to be this second shape here. Now, one of the things about Logic apps that's a bit different function apps, I guess functions do have it a bit, but there's a lot of stuff that App Insights can pick up from the workflow runtime that Logic app has. So all of these storage things here are from that workflow runtime. behind the scenes, so you get a lot of extra traffic from logic apps, which is where I think from a cost perspective, you probably just want to think about how you tune it. So you've got a lot of options to tune it, which we probably won't have time today to go into, but you can sort of reduce the amount of logging that'll get done by tuning some of this stuff here, because these are all the storage calls that aren't really what your code's doing. But you can see I can trace right down. I can see, you know, down here it's making a call out. So that one here is getting a token from Azure AD. That'll be calling out to that's going to be the log analytics data collector connection, which will be this one here. And then I should be able to see a bit further down, it'll have HTTP calls going out. So I think it'll be down here. Now, when it comes to troubleshooting, really what you're doing now is you're starting to look for areas that have had problems in here. And I can do things like, if we go back up the top, for example, where they're a bit easier to read, I can start on the API M1, and you can see I've got the request body. We configured it to capture the request body. So I've got a certain number of bytes from the body. So I could search for other stuff that's in the body here. I've captured, we should have some custom headers as well. So things like down here, it's automatically injecting these headers. And one of the things that Azure as a platform does behind the scenes a bit, it injects a lot of these client tracking IDs, and there's a header that they call like trace parent that they use behind the scenes, and that's what Azure uses when it flows the ID from the functions through Service Bus to the logic app. That's how it connects all this telemetry together by passing these IDs behind the scenes. I'll just pause at this point. Does anyone have any questions or anything at this point? Because I know that this bit can start getting a bit more complicated, and I think that's about as far as I want to cover on this. But if you guys have any questions here, I can maybe dig a bit deeper.
The header and body information is really interesting, because the systems that we're working with, the app service is actually just a web service. It's sort of looking like it's the first steps of the team into using this sort of serverless stuff. So they've just got a website effectively running as a web service.
Yeah.
And when I started looking into it, I couldn't find header or body information at all. It looked like you needed to code that into the site itself to extract that specially, rather than it being automatic.
Is it just like a JavaScript calling an API or something on your web app, or is it your web app calling onto another API?
From what I've seen so far, it's just literally as if you've taken an IIS website and put it into an app service. So
right.
You've got user traffic to a web page, and then the traffic flowing through to an application server backend, which is actually a virtual machine rather than a service or anything. Yeah,
so it will configure, like it will capture some stuff out the box, but some of it you've got to configure yourself. So if you look in my API M here, it's probably the easiest place to see it. So my plant data API, if you notice, I'm kind of configuring some headers that I want it to capture, and some additional like levels of logging and stuff like that. And then in your code, if you've got like a .NET app, so in your host.json, let me see if that's going to open up. So you've got a whole bunch of stuff you can configure in here. So you can configure, it's in this login section, so you can configure the level of login you want. And you've got things like sampling, and then down here you can turn on whether it's going to, like what headers it's going to collect and that kind of thing. But then you could also do some of that in code as well. So I think if you're not getting out of the box just by adding the key, it might be that you either need to tune your config or put something in the code in like a middleware or something to just make it add the extra bits you want.
Yeah, that's sort of what it was looking like when I was going through the documentation. It's sort of another layer of the middleware that's extracting that and squirting it back into the log analytics.
There is a couple of things. At the end, I'll just mention an article I've written, because you can actually tune this host.json file via the app settings in an app service, so you can turn things up and down without having to redeploy the code, which is quite handy as well. So I'll mention that later on. Okay.
Also, the way that you've got it lined up there, just if you go back a slide to the sort of one app insights resource per API management resource. If is there any benefit if you had a number of similar functions or similar API management resources, sort of coalescing those into a single application insights resource?
So what I would normally do, it's easier if you think about an app service plan. So I would probably do one app insights for all of the apps on a single app service plan. So if I had one plan with 3 apps, I'd point them all at the same app insights. And I think that the reason for that is if you can separate them, but you're going to get a lot of the same performance counter metrics go to that app, the different app insights. But if you, I think if you had, like, say, I had the app insights and the APIM and an app service and a logic app all send into the same app insights. They're all on different, if you think about the idea that they're all on different servers, really.
Yeah.
And I think when you start troubleshooting things like the performance counters and because they're running on different boxes, I think it just makes it that bit harder to see a view of how that plan's running. So say you had 2 apps and the problem was that you were using too much resource on the plan. I think it would just get so awkward to troubleshoot and separate what data came from what plan. And that, thinking about an app insights like a view on log analytics, means you've got a view for each compute node. But then if you need to view it across nodes, you just go down to the log analytics level and just do it in custom queries.
Gotcha, yeah. And so service plan level for the app insights rather than resource group level or anything like that?
That's my preference. But I think you do, I've definitely had debates with people in the past where some people have done it different ways. And I think it kind of just depends what, it's one of those things where I wouldn't say there's a best practice. I would say there's pros and cons of each. And it's, if you had if you had 1 or 2 apps, it probably doesn't make any difference. But if you had hundreds of apps, it's probably a bigger kind of trade-off, about what the management overhead of it is and stuff.
Yeah, what I've walked into so far is every single app service website effectively has its own instance, app insights instance. Thinking that I could simplify that down a bit by having a lot of them going to one. But
I think one thing maybe to think about, if I had with app insights, it's kind of like the sampling concept I talked about before. It's a lossy telemetry pipeline. So it means if your app sends telemetry, it's not guaranteed. It's not like a transactional guarantee that event will appear in App Insights. It's more to give you an idea of what's going on. So under load, what happens is you typically would have sampling configured for a high load app anyway, so that when your app's getting stressed, it'll drop telemetry events and prioritize the performance of your app over the telemetry data. So that's where you can kind of you can definitely lose events there for one if you've got a lot of load, but also because it's not guaranteed delivery. That's where if you had 2 apps on the same app service plan, but they were both going to be quite heavily loaded, that would be a reason to maybe separate them out. But I'd probably test that before doing it, just from from the trade-off of making it more complicated versus the benefits.
Thank you.
I'd expect that 2 different apps. Certainly, if you were sending, there's 2 places you can lose the data. You can either lose it on the compute node or lose it on the ingestion into App Insights. And I think if you've got 2 separate App Insights, you'd be less likely to lose it on the ingestion if you had 2 heavily used apps. But heavily used apps, you're definitely going to. So if I go and show you that code here. So the sampling settings are here, and I've got so sampling's enabled. I'm going to send a max of 1 item per second. So I'll just tune that really low so I don't get that many events going to App Insights, which actually, to be honest, for this demo, I probably should have tuned that a bit higher, really. And you can say things like here, it's saying ignore exceptions from sampling, but you might say ignore requests but include trace messages. Particularly with logic apps and functions, you get loads of trace messages from the runtime, so you'd quite often exclude them from let the trace ones be sampled, but maybe not the requests. But it's a bit of a kind of a ninja level skill tuning this to how you want it. But I often find if you get it right for one app, most of your apps will probably just use the same thing. And like here, if you notice, you can configure so that these bits here are like the default level trace levels for each area of the runtime itself. So I've got like info for the function results, and then most of the kind of the runtime settings I've got quite high, so they don't send that much data. But then on an individual function basis, I can, so like here I'm saying set that one to information, but I could have this one could be warning, and you'd have like individual functions would send more or less trace data and that kind of thing. I usually, if you've got a high performing app, sometimes I might turn this one off on some of the apps as well, because you'll see later on you actually get mountains of performance counter data goes in your app insights logs as well. Okay, so next up, let me swap these over again. I know we're kind of going quite a lot for time here. We're okay till 8:30. I think the meeting was booked for, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's no real time limit. I only just put one on as an indication, so don't worry about that.
Perfect. Okay, I'll just watch till you guys all drop off from board. So next section is called simplified logging, and the idea here is it was really easy to configure it so that I get a lot of telemetry data with very little effort. So that's a good thing. But the trade-off is that because there's so much log data, sometimes it could be hard to mine it. So for example, you saw all of that data from storage accounts that Logic Apps was putting in, and I mentioned functions can do the same thing. What if you just want something a bit simpler? So here we're going to look at, again, the loaded railcar interface, and I'm going to show you a pattern that we can do where we can do a bit of a custom thing. So if you imagine the out of the box stuff, I can configure quite a lot of things, but the one thing I can't really do is craft my own log message that easily. I can do it with like a log info from a function. It's quite good, but it's a bit harder from things like the Logic Apps. What I want to do here is we get our message coming through, and I can actually write directly to Log Analytics from both standard and consumption Logic Apps, because there's an out of the box connector for it. And you could also write, for example, from a function app, if you wanted to do some custom code with a NuGet package or something, you could write into Log Analytics. But here I want to just do something a bit more custom. So in the Logic app here, you can see there's this shape called send data. And what I'm doing is I'm basically saying, here's a custom log that I've got, and I craft a JSON message. So here I've just got key value pair of name and ID, and I've got it to inject the name of the Logic app and the run ID. So that run ID, if I see that in my logs, which you'll also see that appear in App Insights as well, you can actually trace back to the run history in your Logic app, which is really good for troubleshooting. And what I can do as well is I can actually put one of these properties, I could put a JSON object, and that would appear in the custom logs, and I can kind of expand into it, which is quite cool. And over on the Logic App standard, you can see you've got the exact same action here, and you can just do it in the exact same way, which is really a nice way to do it. So I've got my custom log message here. And if we go back over here, so my Log Analytics is down here. So I'll just open that up. And we can go into the view logs bit here. Now, we're going to have a look at these tables a little bit more later, but what you'll find is App Insights, when they write into Log Analytics, you'll end up with these tables here from App Insights and these ones from Log Analytics out of the box. This custom bit is where my custom table appears, so I can start doing a query here where I can say, right, let's query my custom table and see what I've got in it. So those properties, if you notice from the previous action here, we're sending these properties in, they're just automatically appearing here, and I can do a nice little search. And I can do things here like, let's say I want to go, right, find only things for railcar loaded to Cosmos. I can just, expand that. I can go, what about only things for that railcar? So here I'll kind of take that off, and and I'll be to kind of dig into this a bit more. Here's everything across all of the different logic apps, just for that railcar ID, so I could get the ID and go and troubleshoot one, which I think is quite a handy little feature. And then, like, I'm not sure how familiar people are with Custo, but if I had a JSON object, I'd be to expand it here and kind of like add them properties as filters and that kind of thing. And you can do things like, I could do a summarize count by logic app. So you could do something really simple like that, and we could say how many of each logic app have we had for that rail car in the last 24 hours. You could change the what about if we said last 30 days? You can really easily build graphs like this, which is where the power of these custom logs come in. You can do this kind of thing with the out of the box logs as well. But if you're doing your own custom log messages, you can kind of create views that are going to be much better to the scenarios that you want. Now, what I can do in both App Insights and Log Analytics, if we go back over here, I can go into the logs from my App Insights as well. Now, what this is going to do is if I do over here, so let's say we look at the app requests table, this is going to give me requests logged by all the functions, all the logic apps and all of the APIs across everything, all in one table. So you may want to do that holistic query, but if you want to do just API-M, would use this requests table, which is basically the same table, but it's more like a view where it's filtered just for API management. So I could start querying. You can see these are all the API calls I've had recently, and this is probably where we ran that test before with those simulated tag data coming in. So I can mine in and see. I can go. It's going to be in here probably. So I can see. Look for all the post operations. So we'll have a look at some of the fancy stuff you can do with this data in a minute. Okay, so now we've got data from two formats, out of the box and custom. What can we do with that data that's going to make us look like rock stars? So I mentioned these tables here. So we've got the out of the box tables and Log Analytics, and we've got the custom table. And if you imagine, I've got my log data in this box in the middle, but I can, with these Custo queries, I can do dashboards in Azure, or I can do things like Power BI with them. So one of the really cool things that I did was I created a bunch of tests, which we'll look at in the next section, and I can write some queries that gets me a summary of how these tests are running, pinging all my different endpoints. And we could create a management dashboard in Power BI. That kind of creates sort of an SLA dashboard, which is cool. But I can also create a bunch of different dashboards, either targeted at a technology or a business use case, just pulling together queries from that data. So we're going to have a look at a few of the different things that I've done now, and hopefully you guys will quite like this. So if we jump down here, right, so filter for Azure workbooks, and I've got a few of them. So you can really go to town with these workbooks, to be honest. So here I've got one where I'm looking at my API functions, and I can just put together some queries that at the top, how many functions have been used over the last 30 days. You see we had this spike from the test earlier. How many executions have we had in the last 24 hours of each function? What are the average durations? This is looking at my API functions, and you see how long they're taking and that kind of thing. I can get a list of the events that happened. So like all the requests that came in, were they successful? I could do things like bar graphs of how, what my success to failure rate was. And for the workbook, really all you're doing is you add a widget and then you give it a custom query. So this one here is looking at over the given time period, look for all the requests and pull out the method, and then I've basically projected to create this like a data set that I'll create this graph, and then I just render it as a time chart. And it's really the same concept for all of these other widgets. They're just custom queries displayed in the dashboard. Now, that means I can do some quite cool stuff. So if I want to look at my logic apps, here I've got the idea of the run profile. So across a period of time, how many logic apps have I had running and how many have ended and that kind of thing. How many of each logic app have been successful or failed? I don't think, yeah, we've got a couple of failed down here. So that's over the last 24 hours. I can see when have I had my errors over a period of time. So you can see I had quite a lot during that time, and then otherwise it's been fairly good. I can project out. So if we look at this query here, it's probably quite an interesting one because I can project out. So you can see these queries can get pretty complex. I'm looking at the trace messages. I work out the run ID, the workflow. Is it the end of a workflow running and did it fail? So that gets me the right data, and then I can pull out the error messages here. You see like railcar doesn't exist, and these are a bit more generic, but it can give me like a list of any errors recently, which is quite handy. And then I can just have different visuals of the same stuff. And here I can even do things like look for long running requests in my logic app. So these are some of the shapes that are quite slow and I might want to look at from a performance perspective. You can do the same, I guess I'll skip that one for time. You can do the same for API management. So if you're building an API, I can do how many requests have I had by day in the last 30 days, errors the same, how many calls have I got to each API. Then one of my favorite ones, I think, is a bit further down. So this is where it starts getting quite funky. So because out of the box, when a logic app calls API management, it automatically adds headers that tell you which logic app and which run ID made that call. So that helps you kind of get back. If you saw an error in API management, you could work out which logic app it was that would have failed. Now, because I'm getting that, I can work out which logic app uses which API. So here you can see my railcar receiver logic app, which is a consumption one, by the way, as well. It uses the conversion API, and it uses these half a dozen different operations here, and how many times I've used them over the last 30 days. And then this one's the logic app standard. The Lotus SAP used that SAP API, and it's a really good way. I often find on a big integration customer, you might have hundreds of logic apps and hundreds of APIs. Who uses what, and is anything not being used? You can kind of work that stuff out here, which is really cool. And then the last bit I think in this section is really what about my custom logins? So there's a couple of things you can do here. So firstly, we had my custom logged messages, but I can also do tracked properties. So excuse me a second, and I'll just go. So I'll go back to my logic app standard. Just remember which one it is. I think it's this one. So in a logic app, one of the things you can do is you can add tracked properties to a message. So I think on this one here, I've added a load slip ID property, which I can kind of project out from the JSON message that shape has. And that'll actually add that load slip ID to the app insights message that gets logged. And then when I'm doing these queries here, you can see I've got things like this one's from the consumption logic app using tracked properties. You can see I can like look for which logic app. So I know this logic app here processed that load slip ID in that rail car. And I can also do exactly the same thing for logic app standard against log analytics. I can work out who used, who processed what rail car, and I can pull out data from the message, like the product code and stuff. So they're a bit more, I guess if we look at them queries, you'll see they're a bit more advanced here, because you're pulling out, see here, this extend is me creating my own column in the data set, but I'm actually digging into a JSON message that was in here, and it lets me get these track properties out, which is quite handy. And then I can, in this one here, so if you imagine these two with the track properties are just using out of the box logic app features where I'm extending a complicated query, but this one here is the one where I wrote my own log message. So I get the same output, I just implement it in a slightly different way. But you'll notice the query is actually a lot simpler here, because I've just got my own fields where I'm sort of telling it the things that I want, which makes it really easy. Now, if you think where a lot of this comes into play is if you think about the idea of, I've got an Azure expert who implements this solution, but the person who supports it on a day-to-day basis probably isn't that Azure expert. It'll probably be somebody, and the more you can kind of move the support away from your experts to more IT generalists in your team, the better the cost savings are for running your systems. So things like these queries here, as a support person, I go, right, here's all the logic apps today. Oh, this one had an error. So I go, right, get that ID. It's delivered to SAP. So we go over here. We can go into this logic app. We can just stick that ID in here. You can see the little tick means it knows which one it is. Opens it up, and then I can say, right, let's see what happens. So this is the message we received. And have a look down the workflow, and the likelihood is this web service might have got an error. I mean, in this case it was successful, but we could go and have a look and see, oh, here's what the error was, and we can troubleshoot from there. So that's a really easy way to get a not highly experienced Azure person to be able to have a look and triage some of your support cases. Sort that slide out so it comes up on the right screen, I think. Right, next up, we've got availability testing. So this is, again, another really cool, easy to use feature in App Insights, which will give you some good value. So the question is, how do I know if the key parts of my architecture are up and running? So App Insights has this this availability test, and there's a few different advanced ways you can do, but the easiest way is called a ping test, which is really just a hit of an HTTP endpoint. And then you can validate the result that came back. So you can say, was it successful? Did I get a 200 or something like that? And for people doing things like websites, you could just ping your home page. And if it's there, great. And the minute it goes down, if it gets more than, say, 3 or 4 failures, you can have it ping you an alert. But you can also do things like we have API management where we build these health check APIs. So I can have App Insights that constantly ping it. And then it might go and say, is my function available? Is my other function available? Or down here, I might say, hit a logic app that does a test that we can send a message to service bus, so we know service bus is available. Hit a logic app, and I think the diagram's wrong here, but hit a logic app that makes a call to SAP to check SAP's up and running. So we can get some good tests that the dependencies of our architecture are all working effectively and start getting alerted to problems before messages start failing, which I think is really, really handy. Now, to implement that, we go over into the, so let's have a look at API and App Insights. I'm just going to shut a few of these down. Okay, so in my API here, you might have noticed this earlier when I opened this up and there was all these APIs, but I've got this health check one here, and I've got these operations that are on it, and Cosmos check, and all I'm doing is I'm doing it in HTTP GET, and this one here just says, is APIM available, is Dataverse available, etc., etc. And in the availability tests over here, it's actually quite easy to set one up. So you go, give us a standard test, give us the URL. Do you want to parse the results or anything like that? I'm really just after a 200. How often do you want to do it? You can do it from multiple locations. So App Insights will run these from the CDN network on Azure. So you've got all these different locations you can have it ping from if you're building like a global site. And I can just say, you know, is it a 200 response? Do I want any alerts or anything? And then down here, you can see I've got all the different tests that are running. And so I can click on, say, the Cosmos one, and you can see that that's running at 100% SLA at the minute. On the scatter plot, you'll see all the different calls that have been made. So you can see when it's been called and how long they took. And, you know, my SAP one here, you can see nice quick response times. And that shows me, you know, just things are really easily hanging together. And it's a really good, simple way to kind of get a quite powerful health API and a health sort of diagnostic check going on. And if you have things like if something's going wrong, one of the first things we do is go and check these tests are running pretty good. And you'd notice from the slides here, this is the thing that I built, that management dashboard I talked about on. I just did a custom query of the availability test log in Log Analytics and just display the results, and you can kind of merge them to get a nice graph over time and stuff. Okay, so that's kind of the endish. Just to summarize, right, so there's lots of ways I can use Log Analytics and App Insights. It's really powerful. It gives me a lot of stuff. There are a couple of limitations on end-to-end tracing. So particularly that logic app consumption, because it's not using App Insights, it's using Log Analytics. That's one place where you can't join the dots. But you could do it yourself if you went into Log Analytics and wrote your own query. In App Insights, it would do it out the box for you where it can. Now, there is another scenario. I'm not sure if this is still a problem or not, but it used to be if you went through Service Bus, there were a couple of scenarios where you could lose the message as well, like lose the sort of distributed trace because it didn't join it together properly. But I think that's kind of working okay now from the looks of it. The big thing with Log Analytics and App Insights is be careful of the cost. So I think I'm going to show you just this because I think it's important to be aware of this. Oops. So particularly with things like functions and logic apps, Log Analytics is going to App Insights is going to get a lot of telemetry data. And if you look, here's the logs that I've got. So I'm just doing a query. If we have a look at that query there, I'm just doing a size of the number of events in each of these tables here. So you can see down here, we've got the app metrics, which is where the performance counter data goes. You know, we've got like tens of thousands of messages. I mean, bearing in mind, I've got almost no load on this system. It just runs a bit to keep it alive. But these are, you know, you can turn this one on and off quite easily. Things like your trace messages, that's another common one that can get quite big quite easily. Your requests particularly as well. So you've got to watch how you're spending your money on this data now. Because with App Insights, you pay based on length of storage and amount of data you're passing in. So if you're getting like millions of messages coming in and you're keeping them for 2 years, which I think is the maximum, you're going to pay quite a lot of money for that. So you want to try and keep your retention period down as much as you can, and you want to tune it to really, you know, get the data that you want. Because I think a lot of people, you'll probably find that 99.9% of the data going to App Insights and Log Analytics and these scenarios you'll never need. But there will be that one performance issue where you might need it, you know what I mean? So you've got to find that right balance. Now, what you can do, I'll just touch on this in a minute, is that tuning thing where you can turn things up and down. And the other thing I just wanted to mention at the end is you've got this thing about the telemetry is not guaranteed, so you may lose events. Don't forget that one there. That, you know, take away that it's really easy to use, it's really powerful, but the cost and the lossless pipeline and the sampling are things you just need to be cautious of. Now, I think in my VS Code here, I've got a little sample. So I've blogged about this, so I'll share the article. But these two PowerShell files, I'm pointing to my function apps, and I can tune the login. So what they would do is they go to the function app and they're reading these files up here, and you can set like that tag there as an app setting would configure that individual function's log level to error. So I could change that value to information and it would increase the login. And you can turn it to error would minimize the login. And then you can do the same on all the different bits, everything in that host.json I showed before about turning sample and on and off, live metrics and that can all be tuned via your config file. So you could, I've just got two PowerShell scripts. I can tune it up or tune it down depending on what I'm doing. So when I normally, I think I forgot about this before the session, but normally I would tune it up before a presentation, then tune it down later just to make sure I'm not wasting any money. Okay, and the very last slide I've got is more info. So there's a whole bunch of articles I've done in the past about looking at some of those custom queries, what you can do with them for both App Insights and Log Analytics. There's stuff around APIM scenarios and logic apps, functions, etc. The one that's the tuning scripts is the one down here at the bottom. And I've got a video from a couple of years ago. I talked a bit about this same topic, a bit more from a logic app perspective. But that video is online here. And I've also the stuff I've talked about today, I actually recorded some YouTube videos on the same demos that I'll probably release next week sometime. So there's plenty of stuff out there. There's also quite a lot of other people have blogged about some of this stuff. And again, feel free to give me a shout on LinkedIn or Twitter if anybody wants to ask any questions or get any advice. Other than that, I'd just like to thank everybody for listening. Hopefully you all found that useful. Feel free to come off on the mic if anyone wants to ask a question, and I'll keep an eye on the chat as well if you guys have any questions.
Thank you for that. I was just wondering, there's a lot out of the box for looking at the things you're creating. What about self-reflection, like the monitoring of the monitoring? You're saying it can quickly become expensive. Are there any simple, quick and easy tips for keeping track of how much is being collected, how quickly it's changing? So if you have a spike in the volume being collected and also capping it perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. So so there's a few things. Am I, just a quick check, Derek, am I allowed to talk about third-party products as well on this user group? Is that okay? Or
Yeah, that's fine. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'll show you, there's a couple of things here. So normally in a resource group, you've got the cost manager features, and I'm just checking because I think this subscription I've got here is an Azure sponsorship one, so I think I might not get the cost data. So I'll just go and find my MSDN one. So in here, for example, let's say I've got a Synapse proof of concept. So you'll see you've got the cost analysis areas down here, and you'll a little bit slow in that, but I'll just give that a second to load up, and I'm going to just open something on another screen. So let's load this on the other screen. So you'll see here you've got, you get like information about how much money you spend. And I've got to be careful with this demo because I sometimes run out of MSDN credits on it. This is where my Synapse one is. So you can kind of track stuff in here, see how it's going. You can create budgets down here as well. So I've got like a budget that'll tell me once I get to £100 and it'll ping me an alert so I know to go and have a bit of a look at something.
Is that just across the subscription rather than specifically the App Insights and bits?
I guess it's more the resource group level. I think a lot of the cost stuff tends to not be at resources so much. There's not really anything here about the resource. Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah. But what So I don't know how much you guys know about, there's a third-party product called Serverless 360 that I do a bunch of product advisory for. So it's a company that's run by sort of an old friend of mine for many years, who's a Microsoft MVP as well, and he kind of created a bunch of products a few years ago. And it's kind of it addresses the idea of, I mentioned it a bit earlier, where support's really complicated to do in Azure if you're not an Azure expert. So the whole concept of Serverless 360 is, can I offload some of that support from experts to be IT generalists and make their job easier, so we can share that support burden, and you have your experts focused on building new apps. There's a bunch of features, and if ever you guys want to do a session, I can talk about some of these features here. But one of the ones that that they've got in preview, that actually I think it's this month or next month it releases into GA, is this cost analyzer feature. So the company behind Serverless 360 is called Kovi, and they build a number of products that they run on Azure as SaaS applications. And we actually had the problem ourselves where we were running this product called Document 360, but you couldn't really track very effectively with Azure how much you're spending money and manage it. So we basically built this feature for ourselves, and then thought, actually, this is really useful. Why don't we put it in Serverless 360, and then other people can use it? And the idea is, I can create, so here you build a tree out on the left. So if you see, I've got my integration area, and I can build this tree structure of cost scopes. So I could say things like, let's go and look. I mean, even at this node here, I can go in and kind of create these graphs that give me friendly views of a set of resources that I want to group together from a cost perspective. So I can see, I think this one's just an MSDN subscription. So I've got how much am I spending on each resource? What's my total cost over the last few months, and that kind of thing. And the idea is I would go in, set up some reports, and then I can share them with management people in the IT department, for example, or I could even share them with a business user if they were the sponsor for an app. So you could build a cost node just for that app and say, look, this is how much you're spending on this app. And the first thing is the analysis bit's meant to just make it easier than using the Azure portal, but also you create views that you can save and come back to easily. And then you've got monitoring here where I can kind of configure an alert. So I think I've just got to go into my email address, and I can just kind of configure this. So I'll go and edit here. Do you know what? It's a while since I set this up. I can't remember the button. Add rule, that's the bit I'm looking for. So you can add a rule here where you can say, oh, here's the subscription. Are you monitoring the real actual cost? And then you just put filters on it. So if you were worried about your app insights, you could go resource type, and it'll give you a list of resource types that it can see. And I could see, I don't know if I've got app insights in this subscription. Be that one. So that'll be the log analytics. So I could say search for just log analytics and then create a budget. And so what I would often do this is say have a daily budget. So this would tell me this is how much you're spending at the minute. And let's say I had a couple of dollars a day budget, and then if it starts going past that, it'll start pinging alerts out for you. So you can kind of create much more granular budgets. And then it also has this optimize feature as well, where I think I've got optimized set up here. So I've got this data gateway, which is an Azure VM. That the scenario I have with one of my customers is we've got 4 or 5 data gateway servers. One's in prod, that's always on, but in the test environments, we want to shut them down when the office is shut. And we can go into the optimize, and then I can kind of say, right, here's the resources that I want to manage. So I've got this VM, and here's the settings. So when you do this cost optimization, you're writing all these PowerShell scripts to scale stuff up and down and in and out and turn it off. Here you just basically go, right, here's the resources I want to manage, and you could so at the minute we support these resources here. like an app service, you can scale it up, scale it down. A VM, you can turn it on or off, and over time we'll be adding a bunch more resources here. And on the settings, you just say, it's as simple as red or green. I want it on at these times, off every time it's red, and that'll kind of reconfigure those Azure resources based on what settings you configure here. And so you can see, like for that VM, versus it being on all the time, I can have it optimized here, and I can kind of save 97% of the cost by only having it on between 10 and 11 each day for my demo. But I think for what you're saying, for your use case, that analysis bit here would be how you can track the cost and work out what you're spending, and then the monitoring bit would be where you can kind of create those more granular budgets. And that's where I think either serverless or some of the other third-party tools, they just go that bit further than what you get in the Azure portal. To me, it's handy here. You can do some good stuff with it, but I think one, it's really difficult to have somebody who's like, a lot of teams, you'll have a bunch of techies who are really comfortable in the portal, but then the team manager probably doesn't really know how to navigate the Azure portal to find his cost data. Whereas in serverless, for example, we can just create, team bosses reports, put all these reports there, and he gets them in one place. And it doesn't matter necessarily whether the resources are in different resource groups, different subscriptions, even different tenants potentially. You could group them together as one or a couple of reports, easy to get to.
Thank you. And it looks easier than creating the sort of log analytics queries across whatever it is that's looking at its own usage, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, you could maybe do you could do some queries like custom queries if you wanted to look for apps that were logging more data than you're expecting and stuff like that.
There's no sort of capping, so if it gets to this point, stop doing what you do. Things.
Yeah, so you can. Yeah, definitely. So let me go back over here. I've got in here. So you can configure a bunch of stuff now. One thing I just need to check with this. Okay, so App Insights. So you've got the usage down here that you can get an idea of how much you spend and on App Insights and on its own. You can see how it's not really very granular here, but you can. So this setting here, I think, is more managed in Log Analytics now. So you would you'd set your retention, which I think is going to be in here. So you can have like a daily cap of how much data you can log.
Okay.
And, you can set your retention period and that kind of thing, but you can also tune it a bit here, daily caps and that kind of thing. So you can protect yourself from cost with quite a few features. You can have alerts and stuff as well. So if you've got that really noisy app, or you know what it's like, a few companies where everybody's delivering new products so quickly, they sometimes forget about looking at this stuff, and you go in and there's things you can't easily change, but you could use these settings to sort of stop yourself getting an unexpected bill and that kind of thing.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, guys, so if the questions are drying up there, we'll just wrap that up. Thank you very much for listening for me.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, if there's no more questions, yeah, I guess we'll leave it there. Next month we've got 2 speakers. You said trying to remember what they were. We've got one around Microsoft AI and Bing and all the new sort of stuff that's implying, and then we've also got one of the guys from the Postman team talking to us about Postman automation and all those kind of things. So that should be good. 7 o'clock next month. I think it's something like the 23rd of March, something like that. But as I say, keep an eye on the shiny new website and Twitter, etc. And I'll let you know as soon as I'm sure of what the dates are. All right. Well, thanks once more to Mike for that. That's been really great. Thanks for everyone for attending, and hopefully we'll see you next month.